If you've been following the story, you know it goes a little something like this. DAZN bought Foxtel for billions. It's kept the NRL, and now comes the hard part, making the economics of this mega deal work. Because the NRL has secured $5.3 billion for the TV rights to its game for the next 7 years, but someone has got to pay for it. And there are a lot of questions. Will subscription price rises? Can the NRL really become a global sports product? And what happens to every other sport in this country when deals for the AFL and the NRL keep getting bigger? Well, there's a lot to get into, so let's do it, because if you want to know what's really going on in sport, you got to follow the money.
And now it's time.
It's time!
It's time for
Moneyball.
Moneyball.
Are you familiar with the story of Moneyball?
Hey team, welcome to Moneyball, the business of sport, the show for sports insiders and for fans that want to know what is really going on in the game. How you doing? I'm your host, Scott Keenan, and if you like the show, please subscribe on YouTube or give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to the show. Now, our big guest today is Murray Barnett. He has worked as the head of sales at DAZN, and he has got some really great insights that can help us understand where the NRL TV rights story is going next. He's had a long career as an expert in sports broadcast and commercialising sports rights at ESPN, at World Rugby, at the Irish FA, and at Formula One, where he was the head of global sponsorship and commercial partnerships. And today he's going to take us inside DAZN. Murray, mate, thanks for joining me. Now the deal is done, I've got a scenario for you. Let's go back a little bit. DAZN just spent billions acquiring Foxtel, and almost immediately they had to renegotiate to retain the NRL, one of the biggest sporting assets in the business that it had just bought. Take us into the company for a moment. What would its strategy have looked like, and what would they have been thinking going into a negotiation like this?
Well, firstly, Foxtel is such an important acquisition for DAZN in many different ways. You know, as probably some of your viewers and listeners will know, is DAZN obviously a global sort of sports player. They've been talked about as kind of the Netflix of sport. They're now trying to pivot to call themselves a little bit the Spotify of sport, if you like. So acting as the sort of platform on which other sports can play, and to a certain degree, DAZN has some input in that or not, depending on the type of relationship it has with the rights holder. But I think the lens to look at the Foxtel deal through is this is the first major rights negotiation under DAZN's ownership, and so it was hugely important for DAZN to retain it, and even for Foxtel as well. You know, it's kind of one of the key pillars of the programming that they've got. So I think they went into it with a feeling that they had to keep it at all costs.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, I've been saying throughout this process that I think that the NRL and Nine and DAZN, they all needed each other and they all needed this win. The NRL needed broadcasters to pay billions, and Nine and DAZN, you know, arguably had the most to lose. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about before, I think that the NRL has spent a number of years leading up to this moment to try and make sure the market was in the right place. They probably didn't see DAZN coming in terms of their deal with Foxtel, but they had laid the groundwork really well for DAZN to sort of be able to come in and sort of back Foxtel to the hilt in terms of getting the deal done. And I think DAZN has different ways in which they can think about monetization than perhaps Foxtel had by itself.
How do you think the negotiation would have gone? How tough do you think it would have been handled? We know DAZN wanted everything. They put in that bid. So did Nine through, Nine and Stan Sport. They wanted everything. So they were kind of antagonistic opposition. And then the NRL, I guess, were really playing them off each other. Inside those boardrooms, how tough do you think that negotiation would have been?
I'm not sure it was as tough as perhaps it looked like from the outside. DAZN knew that they needed a free-to-air partner because, as you know, the various sort of anti-siphoning regulations that you have in Australia. I'm not sure that the heft of Nine was enough to be able to really compete with DAZN, and I suspect that a large part of them going for the whole lot was a little bit negotiating strategy as well, knowing that they were going to have to find some kind of accord with DAZN. You know, it's kind of best of both worlds. If they end up being successful, they would have, sharpened their pencil and worked out what that number is. But at the worst case scenario, it puts them in a good negotiating position with DAZN. And indeed, if the numbers are to be believed, it looks like Nine paid about a 15% increase or something like that, which is fairly modest. But at the same time, Nine absolutely needed to have some of it, because live sport is one of the few sort of drivers of being able to monetize advertising, right? So I think it probably was, Nine and DAZN, or Nine and Foxtel were a preferred sort of partner, if you like, and so they made to be that it was a good marriage, if you like, and as I said, I'm not sure that really between Nine and Stan they could have competed with DAZN, because the interesting thing about DAZN, or the interesting thing about this deal in particular, is the global element to it as well. DAZN are making a pretty big bet here that they, working with NRL, can really monetize this on an international basis, and we can go on and talk about that, but I think I'm a little bit skeptical about that, just because of the size of rugby league globally. But again, it's a long-term deal, so it gives them the best shot at making it successful internationally.
Yeah, I'm definitely keen to pick your brains a little bit about that. But let's just stay with this for a moment, because DAZN got what they wanted. They got to keep the NRL, but the NRL got $5.3 billion from DAZN, from Nine, and from Sky Sport in New Zealand. And now somebody's going to have to pay for it. The annual increase, or the annual rights costs are increasing enormously. And you've made the point to me that Foxtel and Nine might effectively be paying more here to break even than really to grow. What do you mean by that?
Well, firstly, there's no getting away from the fact this is an absolutely stunning deal for NRL. I think it bucks the trend in the sort of the marketplace, not just in Australia, but globally. I think it has some big implications, which we can go on and talk about some upcoming negotiations. But ultimately, the people that pay for it are the consumers. I think there have been some cautious statements from Patrick Delaney and so on, or some comforting statements from people like Patrick Delaney, trying to temper people's views about how much subscriptions are going to increase, but they almost certainly will. And there'll be a higher expectation around how DAZN might be able to commercialize it outside of that, be that sponsorships, be that advertising, and so on. But by nature, those are not primary revenue streams. The one that really makes the difference is the subscription. So, can you give us a feeling then of where this might be going? Because, as you said, Patrick Delaney and the NRL made a really big thing about keeping Kayo Sports and Foxtel affordable for the average fan. But the economics underpinning this mean that surely prices are going to have to go up. Affordable is a sort of what's the subjective word, right? Exactly. It's a nice way of skirting round what they're actually planning to do. My guess, and it's purely sort of an assumption from what I've seen elsewhere, is that they'll try and put in a moderate increase immediately, but then we'll be looking to see how that impacts in, say, a year's time or so on, in terms of subscriber retention and subscriber acquisition. And then you may see some significant rises in the future. But again, and we'll go on to talk about this, a lot of this will also depend on where AFL ends up. Foxtel, I wonder, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, they've got a few different strands to the business. They've got the old set-top box. They've obviously got Binge, which is their entertainment streaming product, and Kayo Sports, which is their sports streaming product. Do you think they would want to simplify their business and move people more into streaming, where there's a simpler business model and less infrastructure that they've got to manage? Could that be a way that they could save costs over time? Yeah, I think everybody's moving towards a streaming-only product when they talk about pay TV. Part of that is as we get more and more robust broadband infrastructure, but also perhaps more importantly, it's a massive customer data acquisition play, because it's much easier in a streaming world to be able to really nail down what people are watching and how they're watching it, and a much less cumbersome infrastructure for the operators. So, yeah, eventually it'll probably be streaming only. Now, DAZN does have experience in other markets where its strategy and commitments have changed, and where the economics of the deals that they've done haven't necessarily worked as expected. You know the company reasonably well. What should Australian sports fans realistically expect about what Foxtel and Kayo Sports might look like under DAZN's ownership? Well, you're being incredibly diplomatic, and maybe just to build out on that. In France, they acquired French League football and subsequently pulled out of it. In Belgium, they acquired Belgian League football and pulled out of that. They've renegotiated their deal with Serie A for their Italian service. So, on the face of it, it doesn't sound great. But I think Foxtel is slightly different in that in those other markets, DAZN was operating itself, if you like, directly. And I think here what they bought is a very robust and strong management team and operation in terms of Foxtel. And indeed, you're seeing within DAZN already that the Foxtel senior staff are very much being integrated at the top level of the company. So I think it's slightly different in that it's a much more calculated acquisition because you had the sort of the experts or the expertise that existed at Fox Sports, at Foxtel, actually driving the acquisition, as opposed to DAZN sort of coming into the market and trying to make a big play as a new entrant. So I don't necessarily think DAZN's failed experiments in some other markets tell us much about this, and I mean that in a positive way, in the sense that I think this is a much more robust acquisition by DAZN through the Foxtel sort of team, if you like.
Yeah, my understanding from some people I've spoken to is that DAZN was extremely impressed with what they bought at Foxtel, that they hadn't seen done sport in the way that it's been done here. Are there any lessons, though, do you think, from what happened in France and Belgium that the NRL and NRL fans could be conscious of?
I mean, as I said before, I think each market is very peculiar to its own dynamics, and I'm not sure that you can really learn very much. I mean, conversely, I would say that DAZN has learned an awful lot through some of these experiments that perhaps didn't go quite the way that they had hoped they would. And so they've improved a lot as well. I also think that each market, and Australia in particular, is such a unique sporting market when it comes to the propensity to consume and to pay for that consumption, that it's also difficult to sort of look at experiments that they've made in Belgium, Italy, France, Germany, wherever, as being analogous to what's happening in Australia. But I think, as we talked about before, I'm almost certain you'll see price increases at some point in the next year or so.
Yeah.
I also think it'll leave DAZN, Foxtel scrabbling around trying to work out what does this mean for AFL? Because if you're AFL, surely you're rubbing your hands together and saying, okay, we're back in the market in, better than I do. Is it 2 years, 3 years?
It's about 3 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's two things in play here. One is sort of ego, if you like. So AFL has traditionally been head and shoulders above every other sport when it comes to rights fees, and so they'll be wanting to try and keep that. But at the same time, they'll be looking at it and saying, okay, strategically, does this make our next negotiation tougher? Because we often talk about this when we think about the global sports marketplaces, that if you think about it like a cake, right? Like, yes, there is a finite amount of money that can be spent on sport eventually. Like, maybe you could bake a slightly bigger cake, but as soon as somebody gets a larger slice of that cake, it just leaves the less for everybody else. And so I think that there'll be there'll be a few glasses of champagne at Foxtel Towers now that the deal is done, but very quickly they'll be starting to think about what are the implications for the next round of rights negotiations that are coming up.
Yeah, because we're a country of 26 million. We are a mature media market, but the pie is finite. We are not America. We are not even the UK in terms of our size and scale. But I do want to kind of explore that a little bit more, because I think this goes well beyond just the AFL and the NRL. They're the two big dogs, and you've got cricket as well, which is our big summer sport here. But netball wants to grow. The NBL wants to grow. Rugby union, the A-leagues, supercars, they all want to grow. And to do that, they need money. And I wonder, what does this do to the economics of those other sports?
It fundamentally undermines them, right? Because there's just less money to go around. I mean, one thing that I should just touch on that makes the economics of NRL better for certainly for a Foxtel DAZN is the length of deal. So one of the prisms that you look through when you're doing rights deals is the longevity of them, because you may not want to pay as much as you've paid, but having certainty about your outgoings for the next 7 years makes a real difference, right? And especially when you're a company like DAZN, which is rumored to be looking to float next year. When you look at the financial markets, they all want to have cost certainty, even if that feels like it's quite toppy, right? And so the big difference when you look at, we talked about some of the football, soccer experiments that DAZN have had in Europe. Those have all been limited length deals of 3 years, and that just makes it very difficult for them to monetize in such a short space of time. So I'm sure that when you look at the spreadsheet for how DAZN put this together, they'll be looking at it and saying, okay, we're paying more than we want to in, let's call it years 1, 2, and 3, but we think that by the time we get to year 4, 5, 6, and 7, that's the economics of that are going to look a lot better. And I wonder if that plays into the thinking of some of the other people that come into market. Do they look at the length of the deals that they're willing to offer and say, look, if we think we can get a bigger check by taking a longer term view on it, then is that a good story for us now, or does that prevent our long-term revenue growth? And so that'll be something which I think, the likes of AFL, cricket, even some of the other sports in Australia will be looking at in terms of, is that one of the things that they have to play with? But I would be very, very worried if I was anybody other than AFL, really.
Yeah, and I think it allows the broadcasters to do a few things as well. They would be charging more in years 5, 6, and 7 for advertising than what they would be in years 1 and 2. The other part of this deal that's so interesting, and it wasn't talked about a lot, but the international side of things. So DAZN has got rights, obviously, to broadcast in Australia, but also international rights. And I don't think, because they're a new entrant here in Australia, people fully appreciate what other markets they're operating in. I understand there's a bit of a profit-sharing agreement between the NRL and DAZN for how that will be monetised in other regions, because until now, the NRL's been doing it all themselves through the Watch NRL app. What can you tell us first about DAZN in other regions, and how significant could a deal like this be for DAZN to monetize and for the NRL to grow the game outside of our borders here?
Well, on the face of it, it seems like a good deal, right? So DAZN are talking about something like 100 million subs in 200 countries, something like that. And just, for everybody's benefit, DAZN has sort of core markets and other markets. So if you're living in Germany, or you're living in Spain or Italy, DAZN is one of the top sports broadcasters in those markets. Conversely, in a market like the UK where I am, they're actually very small and have a reputation for sort of combat sports and other sort of perhaps more nichey things. They do have global relationships with people like NFL for distribution of Game Pass, which I think is definitely going to be the blueprint for how they think about NRL. But I think there's no getting away from the fact that outside of a few relatively small pockets, rugby league is a small sport. And to think that you can generate massive growth internationally for the sport is kind of not really realistic. But again,
because part of the NRL strategy has been, you look at it with Vegas and you look at it with Magic Round and the initiatives they've had under Peter V'landys, it's been about selling a story and then kind of going after it. They did that with Vegas, and I wonder whether they're doing that a little bit here with this as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, firstly, with the size of deal that they've got, they can make a massive run at Super League here in England. There's been lots of ongoing talks about NRL taking a stake in Super League, taking it over, et cetera, and that makes a lot of sense. I think you look at things like the Vegas games, which seem to have been very successful. But even so, that's one game or 2 games in one stadium, and you get a great number of people turning up. But last time I looked, I didn't see it make a blip in ratings in the US for
No, most of
rugby
them are
league.
Aussies and Kiwis and people from the UK that travel there to go as for an event. It's not really turning out many locals there, even though they claim people from just about every state have travelled in the US to go to the game. But I reckon you could count on a hand the number of people from some states that would be attending. It's mostly Aussies and Kiwis and people from the UK who are going to watch their teams play in the US for fun.
Yeah, and Union is probably still bigger in the US than league is. And what as you know, I've had a bit of background in Union, and what we saw in the US was that it's very much a sort of expat community or diaspora community thing. So when you put the Sevens on in Vegas or LA, all of a sudden you get the sort of the Islander community.
Yep.
The Brits based out there, everybody showing up, plus some Americans, but it's still a very niche sport there. And I think if we don't know what value Foxtel ascribed or DAZN ascribed to the international elements of this, but with the greatest will in the world, it's only going to make a very small dent into that size of rights fee. But again, having the 7 years to be able to fully exploit it does at least give you a good run at trying to develop this into an international sport. But it's super hard to break into the intrinsic sort of, locally established sports that different countries have. And so certainly if you look at the Northern Hemisphere, if you assume that rugby league's biggest other market is England, it's really still a minor sport here as well.
If the NRL and DAZN hired you tomorrow and said, here's this global audience and these rights, please go and help us find the growth, what do you reckon you would do?
That's a great question. I think the first thing is, I'd be on the plate to go and see NRL directly and say the only way that this works is if we look at it very holistically. We need to be in lockstep about how you think about growth and treat it as a partnership. And, supposedly in the deal, there's upside for NRL on international distribution. So they should be very keen to support all of DAZN's activities. But I think you need to have more games happening internationally. You need to find all those points of local relevance. I think you need to massively increase the social media because and I'm by no means a league sort of a league aficionado, but the thing that interests me about league is it's a much easier game of rugby to pick up than union. And so when you're looking at sort of the wider rugby fraternity of let's call them rugby curious fans in somewhere like the States, league should be in a much stronger position than union because it's much easier to follow, much more analogous in many ways to sort of US sports and other things. And I think that there is an opportunity there to substantially grow the sport, and arguably NRL have the money to do that now. But the question will become, does NRL filter this back to the clubs to allow them to end up just paying more money to players, or do they actually sort of ring fence some of it to say this is really about the growth of the game?
I think it's a great question. You look at rugby is so strong in the US. You've got the World Cup of rugby happening in the US as well in coming years, and I think that's the thing that we forget is that the NRL or the AFL, it's not happening in a bubble. It's in competition with all these other entrenched games and fan bases. What about Formula One? I know you've worked there, and we don't need to go into lots of detail, but they've broken into that US market in the last 5, 6, 7 years. There's now 3 races there. What could the NRL learn from Formula One's experience there, do you reckon?
There's a few things that I would say about Formula One in that having been there right at the sort of post-Bernie era was don't be afraid to take risks. So you got to try stuff. You're never quite sure exactly what's going to land with your audience. So don't sort of overthink your strategy. Like get stuff out there and get that real world feedback of what's going on. Make sure that you're taking a pragmatic view about how you grow it. So you mentioned three races in the US. Well, 2 of those are arguably co-promoted races directly with Formula One in Miami and Vegas. Miami, they're both slightly different makeups. Vegas is 100% promoted by Formula One. Miami's a little bit more of a sort of a joint venture structure with RSE, the owners of the Miami Dolphins. But the point being is that they saw that they had one race in Texas, and that they wanted to do others, but they couldn't find the right partners to do it. And so they said, well, this is important for our growth, so we're going to forego the traditional promoter pays us a fee relationship to try and come up with a different model. And then that in conjunction with a very aggressive sort of social media strategy of trying to be out there with a lot more content than there ever had been before. And just like firing on all of those different media channels to try and find what works.
Investing in infrastructure, right? In Las Vegas, they've built a lot of that infrastructure that's there permanently now.
Well, also, you know, the thing that probably gets lost a little bit in the Vegas story, because as a sort of semi-publicly listed company, Formula One is out there trying to tell a very good story, is that it's cost them a ton of money to do Vegas, and they're not going to see a profitable return on that for a while. But it has much bigger implications for Formula One across its entire ecosystem, which has resulted in, you know, massive increase in fees from Apple in their new TV deal in the US.
Mate, thank you so much for sharing some time with us and your expertise. Really great to hear your perspective, and I'd love to have you back on Moneyball again another time soon.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and you know, I think this is a fascinating deal that we'll still have a lot to talk about even in, you know, a few months' time.
Moneyball.
Wow, so that is a little taste of what it might feel like inside the company that has bought Foxtel and Kayo and Binge. And they're now going to have to make the economics of this deal work. It is big bickies, and they are carrying so much of the load for the NRL themselves. Hamstrung in a way a little by the free-to-air rules that require the biggest games of AFL and NRL to be shown on free-to-air channels like 9 or 7 in this country. So they've got to find new value in subscribers, advertising, and potentially taking the game to a much bigger global audience. But as the NRL and AFL command more and more of the available money and attention, the bigger question might just be what it leaves for every other Australian sport that is trying to grow. A huge thanks to Murray for taking us inside the deal and inside the thinking of a business like that. You can find Murray at 26 West Sport. That is his consulting business. And he's also the host of an excellent monthly podcast on media rights called The Bundle, which you can find by searching for Unofficial Partner in your podcast app. I will link to it in the notes for this show. And I'm keen to hear what you think about this as well. Really value your opinion. Get busy in the comments and let me know what you think about the economics of this deal and what you think it might mean for NRL fans and for subscribers to Foxtel and Kayo Sports. It is going to be super interesting to watch, and so get busy in the comments. Let me know what you think. And of course, you can email me anytime as well, askmoneyball.show@gmail.com. If you're watching the show on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel for more breakdowns of the business of sport. You can follow the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That's it for today. A really great show. Thank you for watching and listening. And remember, if you want to know what's really going on in sport, you've got to follow the money. I'll see you next time.